Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ESEA Equitable Service training for non-public schools and SAUs. What we wanted to do this morning is highlight our team and introduce what we do as a federal programs. So our job as the ESEA federal programs team is to ensure that all activities carried out under ESEA meet the federal regulations and compliance components of the statutory language. So we want to be sure that all children are being served, whether they attend a public school or a non-public school, in relations to equitable services. We have listed the contact information of the ESEA team on the left-hand side of the slide. But again, we want to be sure that our non-publics are working directly with our SAUs. So with that being said, we would encourage all of our participants to introduce themselves in the chat box with their name and affiliation. So please take a moment to do so. And while you're putting your name and your affiliation in the chat box, we're going to move on to some housekeeping items. So we do want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and will be available for everyone to view after the fact. One key thing is this training is a requirement to be able to participate in equitable services. So if you see that you have a colleague who may not be on the call today, but would like to participate in equitable services, you want to be sure that you're encouraging them to visit the website where the recording will be housed. We have muted everybody's microphone at this time so that we can engage in the presentation, but we will open up questions and answers at the end. If you prefer to put your question in the chat box, we will monitor the chat box as a team and address those as quickly as possible, which may be at the end of our presentation. So keeping in mind that we do have some material we want to be sure to share with you, and then we'll be sure to also address the questions. We wanted to highlight our learning objectives. And as I mentioned, I just want to be sure that everyone who's in the room understands the content for today. So today is about equitable services. So our participating non-public schools, as well as their accompanying SAU, might be present. So really understanding the how, what, and where associated with equitable services is our goal for today.
All right, we're going to start with an overview of what those equitable services are and some of the basic requirements that exist in order to receive those services. So equitable services is the process of providing students, teachers, staff, and families at eligible non-public or private schools with equitable access to federally funded education programs and services. And what's kind of critical here is that we're talking about access to programs and services being provided to those folks at non-public schools, because the funding, as you're going to hear us say a few times, never directly goes to the non-public school. That has to remain in control of the public SAU. Some of the other basic requirements, including that funding stays directly with the public SAU, is that all equitable services must be secular and non-ideological. And while most folks generally have a good handle on secular services, non-ideological would also include, for example, if you're a Montessori school and you wanted to pay for professional development, you couldn't pay for PD that was specifically about the Montessori method. That would come down as ideological. Additionally, services provided for those non-public school staff and students may differ in what subject areas or grade levels are being serviced compared to the public SEA, as long as all ESEA requirements are being followed and that they meet student needs. And lastly, all federally funded activities must be supported by auditable documentation. Like anything else with federal funds, we want to make sure we have a nice paper trail for what we're doing. So some of the more detailed requirements. First of all, in order to receive equitable services, you must be a Maine DOE approved, nonprofit, non-public school that is serving students from kindergarten through grade 12. If any of those statements don't apply to you, so if you are a non-public school that is not state approved, if you are for profit, If you are only serving pre-K children or only serving post-grad children, then you would not be eligible for equitable services. Additionally, there's some data submission that has to happen. For Title I, it's through our Connect reporting system in October. And for Titles 2, 3, and 4, it's through a survey we put out. We're going to talk more about those both here in a little bit. There are some forms that you have to fill out as a non-public school staff, and your public SAU has to fill out a funding application, a performance report, and sometimes a monitoring requirement. So you as the private school have to sometimes provide additional documentation for all of those. And Titles 1 and 3 also require a formal identification process to determine the students who are eligible to receive equitable services. So how do you obtain those services? Like I mentioned, for Title I, low-income student data is going to be provided in the new Maine Department of Education's Connect data platform by October 1st of the previous school year. This fall, you would have already put this data into NEO, but moving forward, it's going to be in the Connect platform, and there are trainings that are available and some summer trainings that will come out as well. So if you haven't already provided that low-income student data this fall, you would not be eligible to receive Title I equitable services for the 26-27 school year. If you are looking to receive equitable services for Titles 2, 3, and 4, we send out an enrollment survey about this time every year. And what you're going to do is provide your October 1 student counts for Titles 2 and 4 and your October 1 multilingual learner count for Title 3. If you are looking to receive that Title 3 equitable services, you have to make sure you're identifying those multilingual learners in the same way that the public SAU does. You have an established ESOL program with a certified ESOL teacher, and that the public SAU receives Title III to provide equitable services with. And now, less on the technical side, but more on the what you need to do to properly carry out your equitable services. You want to make sure you've conducted a school needs assessment and determined the high areas of student need at your school. You consult with the public SAU on what services would help meet those student needs. You're going to complete and sign a participation form, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And then you're going to work in an ongoing manner with the SAU to complete your project narrative, your budget, some SMART goals, and sort of some long-term planning, some frequent check-ins to see how it's going carrying out all of that work. Like we mentioned, the funds never directly go to the non-public school, and it's the requirement that the public SAU has to oversee the work being done through equitable services. Through monitoring, it seems like one of the biggest issues we've found is a lot of public SAUs take more hands-off approach, and they really should be more hands-on. You should know the needs of these non-public students and what services are being carried out. Tyra's going to talk a little bit about what the fiscal side of that looks like, but it's really important that you're working hand in hand with your non-public partners to make sure that they are following the letter of the statute, just like you're supposed to in your public school program. These services can be provided by a public SAU, or there can be private agreements with private companies to provide, say, like PD to teachers at the non-public school. These can happen on site at the non-public school or at another location. And all services have to benefit the students of the school and not the school itself. And that can be kind of a tricky designation, but like when we get to Title II, I'll talk a little bit more about what that means.
All right. So in continuing on our conversation about equitable services this morning, I think one of the most important aspects of the process of providing equitable services has to do with the initial consultation that takes place between public SAUs and their non-public school partners. So consultation, as far as statute is concerned, is the process by which key leaders from both organizations meet to discuss the needs of their respective students and ultimately how those needs can be met through the use of federal ESEA funding. So realistically, the overall goal of this work is to not only identify, but to also plan and carry out programs and services that are designed to meet the identified needs of students who attend both public and non-public schools within the SAU. So the consultation process itself should include discussion of several important topics, and realistically should be a candid conversation around the needs of students that, as Ryan indicated, resulted from that needs assessment process. So kind of logical step and workflow here. So, following the identification of those highest areas of need for the non-public school students, there should really be conversation around what the various allowable uses are of ESEA program funding that could help meet those identified needs, because there is some autonomy and choice on the part of non-public schools as to which ESEA programs they choose to participate in. So it should be noted that it's not an all or nothing scenario. And so really taking a hard look at what the needs of students are and how we might be able to best map some funding and resources to meet those needs. So once those needs have been identified and some equitable services have been determined, there then needs to be conversation around what sort of long-term performance goals will be established for the resulting resulting projects, and ultimately how or what plans there are for evaluating that work and monitoring its effectiveness over time. So as we've mentioned earlier, consultation around equitable services should be a largely ongoing process. It's not meant to be something that is done once a year at the time of applying for ESEA funds. It is best practice to hold regular check-in meetings between your public school and non-public school partners, just to ensure that programs and activities provided under equitable services are both on track, on budget, and being effective in meeting your desired outcomes. It's best practice to make sure that you're having some sort of regular touch point, so that if, for example, a project were to come in under budget, or perhaps something that was originally planned is not having the intended outcome, there is time and opportunity to pivot, shift, or redistribute funds in a way that can best support the needs of students during that academic year. Now, as part of the consultation process, we also recommend that folks establish some protocols, parameters, what have you, around collecting, sharing, and reporting out on required program data throughout the year. Ryan mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is a really important piece to have a plan for from ground zero, because essentially we don't want to be chasing things at the end of the year in an effort to try and complete reporting. It's really best practice to establish what those protocols and processes look like from the onset, so that we're all set up for success in that aspect of our work. I will also ask that maybe one of my colleagues throw a couple of links here in chat, but we do have some resources on our website that would be particularly helpful for folks, whether they are seasoned or new to the world of ESEA funding and equitable services. The first of which is our resources page, which has a lot of good information. And in particular, I would point folks to a guidance document that we have specifically on consultation with non-public schools. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about process this morning. So next I'd like to talk a little bit more about timeline. Ryan alluded to some of these pieces in what he shared with us this morning, but essentially there are some major milestones that I want to make sure everybody is acutely aware of. So throughout the consultation process, we have some pieces here that start in the fiscal year directly preceding the year in which you hope to receive equitable services. These are specific to Title I. So another way to think about this is for Title I data, you're always looking a year back. So in this instance, for folks that would be interested in participating in Title I for equitable services for the upcoming 26-27 school year, we would be looking for these pieces here to have been completed in July through September of the preceding year. So, and the reason for that is this data is used to determine the level of equitable services or kind of dollar amount here that each non-public school would be eligible for under equitable services for the Title I Part A program. For all other ESEA programs, so Titles 2, 3, and 4, our timeline really begins in March, so realistically now, of the current year, when non-public schools officials would work to complete what we call our private school enrollment verification survey. And this is essentially a reporting out on overall student enrollment for your non-public school. And the reason for that is that oftentimes we may not have that data here at the department otherwise, but that is data that we need to be able to determine what level of equitable services your non-public school may be eligible for. So again, if this is something that you're looking at for the upcoming school year, I would strongly encourage folks to keep an eye out for that survey and get that information to us as soon as you can. Beginning in April and really continuing on through July, that is when we recommend that those formal consultation meetings between the public school, or excuse me, public SAU and non-public school would be occurring. This is also a good time to think about the development of things like project narratives, budgets, goals, et cetera, that would need to be incorporated into the public school district's ESEA funding application. And along with these, there is a form that needs to be completed and uploaded, our Equitable Services participation form. So this might be something too worth having on hand at one of those, at one of your consultation meetings, because it's something that could be easily filled out, signed, and returned to your public school counterparts for inclusion in the ESEA application. And then lastly, October is another important time of year. This is when most of our ESEA reporting on programs and activities that have been carried out through Equitable Services would become due. This might include things like reporting out on the extent to which goals have been met, determining what, if any, funding for Equitable Services might remain unspent. And realistically, just one thing to keep in mind here is that whenever we're talking about reporting for Equitable Services, we're always looking at the initial 15-month period of availability for funds for that fiscal year. And so this would typically run from the date of substantial approval on the SAU's ESEA application through September 30th on an annual basis. So anything that isn't done or expended during that initial period of availability would become what we call carryover funds. And there are some specific rules and nuances around carryover funding being available for Equitable Services. So just some things to be cognizant of here as we talk about timeline and process.
So now we want to actually show you some of these forms themselves. So this is the non-public consultation form that we look at when you submit your New Year's application. Something we wanted to note on this form that we often have to return for is that little checkbox under the non-public school official information. This training is a mandatory requirement. You must watch it whether you're here today or whether you watched it virtually. So that official, that non-public school official, must check that off and say they've watched this before we can give them funds. And continuing on with this form, another couple common errors we see is the bottom two sections. So the very bottom just must be a written signature. Sometimes we see typed ones and, anyone can type in a signature. So we really need to see the written signature there as well as the date. And then in the middle section there where the first red arrow is pointing, this section is talking about disagreements between the public school and the non-public school. So in order to to approve this form, we would want to see yes or NA. If that is not selected, then we'll need additional evidence that walks through some of those disagreements. We also have a separate form for Title I Part D subrecipients. I'll have someone drop that in the chat as well. We have 3 public SAUs who consult with these non-public residential facilities that provide academic support for educated youth. They're NFI North satellite facilities. There's a separate form for those folks, and allowability looks a little different. And we have a training that we did last year with a recording as well that you can refresh yourself on if you need to, if you work with those folks. So carryover, ESEA funds are available for up to 15 months, and that's the initial period of the grant. So from substantial approval through September 30th of the following year. Carryover of funds for non-publics has some different requirements than the public school. These funds generally should not be carried over. This is for very rare circumstances. There are 2 sections on the next form we're about to look at that are very specific. There must be very strong justification, very, very targeted in order to approve carryover for non-publics. So this is what that non-public carryover form looks like. The first part is just what funds are being carried over or returned. In row D, there's 3 options. The non-public school can either carry over funds if there's those additional extenuating circumstances. They can return them to the public SAU, or both parties can opt to return them to the state. And then in option 1, you'll notice at the very, very bottom, the 2 justifications for why a non-public school would carry over funds would be for delayed services carryover, or for an under budget carryover justification. So there's a lot more details on the page itself, but those would be the 2 reasons. Okay. So yes, a little more detail on those. So delayed circumstances due to extenuating circumstances. During the pandemic, we gave that as an extenuating circumstance that everyone was managing. So we granted carryover for a lot of non-publics, but that circumstance is no longer here. So again, the rules are a bit more rigid now in statute. And an example of the budgetary one would be if the cost of equitable services came in under budget. Like a couple that I've approved, the PD got canceled really last minute due to a snowstorm or something like that. So it was at the very end of the year, so there wasn't time to reconsult and find another manner to spend those funds. Those are the types of questions and details we'll ask if a non-public requests additional carryover. And in either case, you also have to prove that this need for services won't be met with the upcoming year's funding. So that's a whole nother layer you'll have to add into that justification that the money for next year will not cover this additional need that the non-public school has. Another piece we wanted to talk about is if a non-public is unresponsive. I've already seen a few questions in the chat about non-publics who refuse funds or just, they stop responding because they just aren't interested in the funds. If that is the case, then we need to have some written documentation for the fact that they refuse funds and, they didn't respond to your attempts to fill out the forms saying that they refuse funds. So you have to reach out to the non-public if you're a public SAU by 3 different methods: email, phone call, certified letter. The certified letters must clearly outline that the party has 2 weeks to respond. what they need to respond with. And all of this must be copied and logged. If we monitor you and you are in this situation, we won't want to see all of that evidence. Yes.
So one area of the statutory language is every state is required to identify a state ombudsman that works with the non-publics and the public schools should there be some disagreement or misunderstanding of regulations and rules. So I serve as the state ombudsman, and as I mentioned, it is established in statute to help ensure that equitable services and other benefits for approved eligible non-public schools and staff are provided. The responsibilities of the ombudsman is to oversee ESEA equitable service requirements. I serve as a general resource regarding equitable services and provide technical assistance as needed. I also try to engage with the non-public schools and SAU officials should issues arise. As Travis mentioned, it is critical to conduct consultation annually with all non-publics within the LEA's boundaries, but it is also important to be sure that consultation is conducted before any decisions are made within the SAU as well, such as transferring of funds. If there is a concern with services or a lack of services provided, the public SAU must provide written justification for the decision to the non-public schools. The non-public school also has the right to file a formal complaint if there is a disagreement about program planning, services, or lack of consultation.
Awesome. I think we're going to go into the various titles more specifically now. So for Title I, Part A, when it comes to equitable services, this was mentioned before, but there's sort of two distinct understandings to have about how Title I works at the non-public. First and foremost, of course, is how the shares are generated. So how does that non-public know sort of the funding available from the public SAU to be able to implement services? That comes from proportional shares, and those shares are from low-income students that would have otherwise attended a Title I school in resident district. So again, Title I is a high poverty grant for schools and SAUs. So we are looking to generate, those shares are generated with students that are high poverty in the non-public and would have otherwise attended a Title I school. So if you think about equitable services in that very sort of concrete way, it's that they probably would have been providing services for them at the public SAU. So you're, as a non-public, trying to be equitable in those services. So that's how shares are generated. The funding available for the services is your low-income students into that Connect data warehouse. And then that student would have otherwise, they live in a school area that has a targeted or a school-wide program for Title I. Then there's the services part. So that's the funding part. The services part, then there's sort of the two caveats there that are more in line with kind of Title I's intent and purpose, which again, that student would be attending a Title I school. So if they were at the public SAU, they would probably be receiving services. And then because non-publics are tied to a targeted assistance type of program for Title I, the students that will actually be receiving services will be ones that would have attended a Title I school and they meet the objective criteria, which can be those assessments, those screeners, and they can be progress monitored throughout to continue eligibility for those services throughout the school year. So that's the key here. Students who generate a proportional share might not be the same as the students who receive services because those two lines there are slightly, they differ. Only children that would have attended a Title I school and are identified as in need of additional services would be then receiving them. So shares are slightly different than the services. And then with Title I Part A, what type of program would the non-public be facilitating? It would be a targeted assistance program. and targeted assistance has its own statutory definitions and requirements. You must only serve Title I identified students with programming, and those are the ones that would have resided in a Title I school in their resident district, as I mentioned a couple times. Must have a process for identifying those students. So again, that have multiple objective criteria that's outlined in statute. So assessments, tracking that Title I student progress. You'd be adjusting programming. Again, Title I is about highest needs, the students most at risk of failing. So if you start to have students that become less risk of failing and more students are falling behind, you would have that progress monitoring. And through that objective criteria, you would be able to sort of shuffle the needs for those students. You would notify families of services. Absolutely. Title I, one major component of Title I is family engagement, understanding that high poverty SAUs must be working with their families. It's the same for those targeted assistance students at the non-public. Their families are notified of services. They understand what they're receiving, how they were identified, and of course, then only be implementing the program with Title I certified staff. And for simplicity's sake, that's state credentialed teachers that would be facilitating that program. Academic supplies can absolutely be used or can be bought to improve the high needs areas for Title I students. For non-publics that partner with an SAU that receives more than $500,000 in family engagement, part of the consultation process will be explicitly to require that non-public to also be discussing family engagement practices because they're tied to that public SAU that has that requirement for family engagement. So if you are a non-public with an SAU that receives more than $500,000 in Title I, you have very specific family engagement requirements and activities that you also need to be facilitating. And then for professional development, often we think of Title II as the PD title, but with Title I, you can pay for PD for that Title I staff specifically. So if that Title I staff is working on literacy with students and science of reading and requires professional development to be more effective with the highest risk students, Title I dollars could go to the professional development for that Title I teacher. And then unallowable uses are going to be basically the opposite of what I just said. When a non-public's providing services to the non-Title I identified students, they would otherwise not have been receiving Title I perhaps in their public SAU, so they're just not eligible. Using non-Title I certified staff to support those students, that's a big no-no. We want to have our certified staff working with our highest need students. And then really paying for supplies or activities or PD that are not related to the Title I targeted assistance program, whether it's a different teacher or students that have not been identified. So you want to stay kind of within the parameters of what a targeted assistance program is and the allowability as it relates to supporting those students' needs.
All right, Title II Part A, whose intent and purpose is to increase teacher and principal quality to raise student achievement. Some allowable uses of funds include any supplemental programs and services that provide professional development for teachers, principals, and other building-based school leaders. And that's really important that is the list. So most often what we see sometimes is folks trying to provide PD for their ed techs, and that's unfortunately not allowed under Title IIA. And that PD does have to meet the definition of PD in statute, which is sustained, intensive, collaborative, job-embedded, data-driven, and classroom-focused, really just trying to move away from like the one and done, send someone to that session out by the airport for half a day kind of session, and more of a long-term plan for PD. And Title IIA can also pay for travel expenses. So if you are sending someone to a multi-day session that's part of your long-term plan, and that's going to require mileage reimbursement, Title IIA can cover that. Title IIA can also pay for work that's being done outside of a teacher's contract hours, and for supplies and materials that are related to PD. So oftentimes we'll see someone buy like one copy of a classroom text that they're going to use as part of the PD session. You just couldn't buy all the classroom text, right? 30 copies for the whole class. Some unallowable use of funds include staffing costs, such as paying for substitute teachers or class size reduction projects, as well as any recruitment and retention activities. And I'll draw some special attention to this because these are two things that are allowable for our public SAUs, but because they fall under that needs of the school kind of section that I mentioned earlier and not needs of the students, they're not allowable with equitable services. You also can't use Title IIA for your curriculum writing or to purchase curriculum materials for classroom use. You can do PD about curriculum. It just can't be spent specifically on funds to write a new curriculum. And like I mentioned earlier, your PD has to be secular. So anything that's based on ideological concepts instead of the needs of the students would not be allowed.
And now we're going to move into Title III, which is language instruction for multilingual learners. Title III has 3 categories under which funds must be spent, and an SAU who's receiving Title III is well aware of those 3 categories and will need to work with the non-public to be sure that collaboratively all of those 3 categories are being met with the Title III funding, whether it be at an SAU use or within the equitable service share. So those 3 categories are improvement of language instruction, professional development, and family and community engagement. So the first category, which is improvement of language instruction, can support activities such as enhancing the existing program, hiring additional supplemental ESOL staff, and adapting targeted programs for students experiencing limited or interrupted formal education, multilingual learners with disabilities, or refugee students. Within the second category, which is professional development, Title III equitable service funds can be used for providing professional development for staff members that work with identified multilingual learners. And again, we want to be sure that the way a non-public is identifying their multilingual learners is identical to the process in which the SAU identifies their multilingual learners. And this work can be best practice workshops, coaching, or working with educational consultants. In regards to the third category, which is family and community engagement, these funds can be used for activities such as creating partnerships with community organizations to help improve student outcomes or to support families, holding events to seek community input on the general education of multilingual students, and more specifically, the impact of the language acquisition programming. And funds can also be leveraged to help train families to become more active participants in the education of their children. For equitable services to a non-public school, the amount of funding is based on the percentage of identified multilingual learners at the non-public compared to the total number of multilingual students at the SAU. Additionally, if a non-public would like to participate in equitable services for Title III, it is the responsibility between the non-public and the SAU to ensure that funds are spent in each of the 3 buckets, as I mentioned earlier. And participating non-publics are required to use funds. Because our non-publics are not required to use funds in each 3 buckets, that is a requirement of the SAU. So the partnership and the consultation and the ongoing conversation is really important to be sure that that statutory requirement is met. This is a review of services as my colleagues have presented, knowing the rules and being sure that we are aware of the unallowable use. This is a review of services that cannot be provided. So again, being sure that it's supplemental in nature and not a core responsibility of the entity, whether that be the SAU or the non-public school. One thing that I want to emphasize is, and I've mentioned it in the last few slides, is the way in which the multilingual learner is identified must be identical between the SAU and the non-public. So the third bullet here says serving students that don't meet the SAU's definition of multilingual. So that would be an unallowable use should the non-public school have a different identification process for their multilingual learners.
And last but certainly not least, we have the Title IV Part A program, excuse me, otherwise known as the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program. This is a multi-purpose block grant that allows states, school districts, and non-public schools to invest federal education funds in various aspects of their educational system. In and of Title IV, there are several different subcategories, content areas, whatever you'd like to call them, under which funds can be used. And regardless which of these content areas that we're talking about, Title IV funds can always be used to support either direct support services for students or professional learning opportunities for teachers and other school staff who are working directly with students. Now, the first of these content areas is known as well-rounded education, which essentially refers to programs and activities that are academic in nature, but that also go above and beyond core academic instruction in math and literacy. So think about things like STEM education, music and the arts, history, civics, etc. Largely content that goes above and beyond, again, core instruction, or that may be more interdisciplinary in nature. We also have the Safe and Healthy Students subcategory for funds, and this largely deals with support services for both physical, mental health, nutrition, etc. for students. And again, this is a content area where we can support either direct support services for students or professional development for staff who are working directly with students. This can cover everything from physical health education to counseling, mentoring programs, nutrition education, and the like. And then the third and final content area for the Title IV-A program has to do with the effective use of technology. And this is really geared towards supporting programs and activities that serve to enhance the use of technology in schools and classrooms to better support instruction, track student progress, things of that nature. This, again, is focused more on the programs and services and less so on the acquisition of devices, software, etc. While that is an allowable component under the Title IV-A program, there is a statutory limitation that I'll speak to here in just a moment. So alongside kind of the general allowable uses of funds for the Title IV-A program, like some of the other ESEA programs we've talked about here this morning, there are a handful of things that are expressly prohibited in statute. I won't go over these in great detail, but largely for Title IV-A, they have to do with various types of medical services, some school nursing pieces, and then nuances around reproductive health education. But really the big takeaway here for at least supports for academics is that anything that we're doing with Title IV-A funds has to go, again, above and beyond core instruction in math, literacy, and science. And if you are trying to support your students in those areas through Title IV funds, you would need to make sure that that content is more interdisciplinary in nature for it to be allowable under the Title IV program. So the Title IV program is also a bit unique as compared to some of the other ESEA programs in that it has specific spending requirements associated with each of the three categories I just mentioned. Now, if you're working to spend funds under either the well-rounded education or safe and healthy student content areas, the total amount spent has to be at least 20% of the overall Title IV Part A award. And so again, this 20% would span the award issued to the public school district, as well as the portion of equitable services that may be available for a non-public school. The effective use of technology category does not have the same minimum spending requirement. There are some nuances that go along with that. I mentioned earlier this idea of devices and software being somewhat limited, and that has to do with a statutory provision around acquiring, quote, technology infrastructure. This is defined as things, again, like devices and software, where you're limited to no more than 15% of the funding that you've budgeted under that specific content area. So let's just use round numbers for a second here. Let's say, for example, you budgeted $10,000 under the effective use of technology category. That would mean you'd be limited to $1,500 worth of infrastructure purchases. So 15% of that amount you budgeted. Lastly, I wanted to draw some attention to some nuances as it relates to equitable services that can sometimes pop up with the content area spending requirements that exist for Title IV-A. As we've shared previously, ESEA funding can support all sorts of different activities at the non-public schools. But that's not necessarily always the case when it comes to funding for the Title IV-A program. Funding between the public school and non-public school for Title IV-A are determined based on enrollment counts. So if you look at the slide here, we have an example where there's basically a 90%, 10% split. And so that's how the funding would follow the enrollment. Now, let's say, for example, with this same makeup here, we have a school district that is spending funding in maybe one content area and not another. If the equitable services for the non-public school would not rise to the level of meeting that 20% threshold for either well-rounded education or safe and healthy students, the non-public school wouldn't in and of itself be able to leverage funds for that purpose, right? Because their funding would only equal 10% of the overall pot that's available. So again, this is a nuance that can pop up specifically with the Title IV program. It's something that you'll want to make sure that you discuss with your public school counterparts and address as part of that ongoing consultation process.
Good morning, folks. We're going to go over the fiscal oversight of federal funds quickly. All expenses that are reimbursed by federal funds must be reasonable, necessary, applicable, allowable, documented, and neutral. In addition, these expenses must be incurred during the period of performance for the grant. So procuring goods or services may not happen until after the public SAU has received substantial approval for their ESEA funding application. Some allowable uses, for unallowable uses, all SEA funds cannot make direct payments to the non-public. Certain expenses are not allowable under ESEA federal funding. Let's review a few here on this slide in the next. At no time should the non-public receive payment from the public SAU. If the non-public orders supplies and then sends the invoice to the public SAU must pay the vendor. It cannot pay the non-public. So some of the unallowable uses of federal funds in general is you can't buy those trophies or awards for ceremonies. Gift cards are not reimbursable. Food, unless it's instructional supplies for students, cannot be reimbursed. And of course, alcoholic beverages. The field trips must be educational trips. So you must be able to prove, say you want reimbursement for the hockey game that you took students to. It needs to be linked to the application for funds and meet a high needs area for the students. In addition to that, all costs associated with the trip must be reasonable and necessary to meet the goals outlined in the application for funds. Ideological includes PD on things like the Montessori method for Montessori schools. That's just an example. So any costs that are non-secular or ideological in nature are unallowable. Fiscal requirements. Services must supplement and in no case supplant services that would, in the absence of these services provided under the program, be available to participating private school students. The SAU must use funds under covered programs to meet the identified educational needs of eligible non-public school students and not the needs of the non-public school, as stated previously in this presentation. The public SAU must also ensure that equitable services it provides under the covered programs supplement services a non-public would otherwise provide. The regulation for use of private school personnel is 34 CFR 299.8, and a grantee or subgrantee may use program funds to pay for the services of an employee of a private school if the employee performs the services outside of his or her regular hours of duty, and the employee performs the services under public supervision and control. So in other words, if you want a non-public employee to provide equitable services under for these funds, then that non-public employee must be under contract with the public SAU. They cannot be providing the services just as a employee of the non-public.
Okay. Unsurprisingly, with federal funding, there are mandatory reporting requirements as well as federal monitoring. So we have in the performance report, so at about the 15-month mark, during the reconciliation form, when the non-public is consulting with the public SAU about remaining funds, about returning those funds, etc., we're also having to submit data to the federal government through our performance report, because the feds want to know who in the non-publics are receiving services, how many students. They want to have that information too, because it's all Title I related. So in a performance report, you have a page called the Title I Part A supplemental data. For ESEA coordinators with public SAUs on the call, probably very familiar with that page. You know, you actually have a column that is specifically calling out the non-public, and that information for the grade levels those students are in, what ethnicities and race they are, and what types of services they received are required to be reporting under for that non-public, and obviously for the public SAU as well. But just want to make sure that the non-publics understand that this data is collected from their programs as well. Monitoring requirements. Similarly, the public SAU is going to be monitored. However, if they have a partnership with the non-public around consultation and services, then those are going to be requirements that they must submit. So we do have items that touch on the relationship between the public SAU and the non-public entity. Specifically want to call out D1 is an item that's related to the consultation. Are you documenting your minutes? Are you filling out your templates? Are you having discussions or emails back and forth about high needs? That is what you would be submitting for D1. B1, C2, and C3 are sort of SAU, but adjacent to non-publics. It's essential that stakeholder groups are stakeholders within sort of how you determine your high needs at the non-public as well. For teacher PD, that means that you at the non-public have actually figured out from your teachers what PD they need. That is all required for the non-public to be doing that work, as well as the public SAU. E5, similarly, Tyra just talked about it. Payments are being made on behalf of the non-public and not to the non-public. So we're looking for a procurement process or policy so that it's very clear how the public SAU interacts with sort of buying and purchasing things for the non-publics to be able to provide equitable services. So when you're at SAU that's monitored and you have a non-public, please be aware that there will be a documentation related to that relationship and that work that you do with each other.
So we completely understand we've provided a lot of information in our training. We will be sharing some resources and some guidance, but as we mentioned, particularly for Titles 2, 3, and 4, we are in the process of collecting the data from non-public schools who would like to participate and are eligible for FY27, so school year 26-27's equitable services. So we will pop the link into the chat box, and which has been done, and that non-public equitable service participation survey is to be completed by the non-public schools and must be submitted by April 1st. That is the indication that the data set is complete and or updated accordingly, depending on if your non-public school certifies data in our October 1 data collection, similar to our SAUs. So again, the due date is April 1st. This is critical if you are seeking participation in equitable services for school year 26-27 as it relates to Titles 2, 3, and 4. As we mentioned, we have a bunch of resources and guidance on our website, and this training is a requirement to participate in equitable services for FY27, excuse me. And our training today is recorded. It will be linked onto our website in these two areas, and that training will be available for when your non-public is ready to complete the consultation form. As always, don't hesitate to reach out to any member of our team. We have been monitoring the chat box, and we will open it up for any questions that we may not have addressed directly in the chat box. But as always, we want to leave you with how you can find all the resources associated with our work, but also the Maine